The new year's coming.
Yes, it is 2023. Woot woot. I love the idea of something new, the idea of day one, but that could be day one of the month or page one. I do love new.
That kind of mindset can happen July 28th or March 10th. I don't really subscribe to the idea of January 1st. I have to have a resolution that I'm going to put this pressure on myself. And if I don't get it by whatever date, then I've somehow failed in the success of my resolution.
I am more objective driven as opposed to goal driven.
If we think about an objective as being something that's beyond you, that you look towards, and it ends up being the beacon.
With that overarching objective, should I take a misstep? That doesn't mean I failed, turn around, stop in the tracks, choose a different direction. So with this upcoming new year, I'm going to resolve, remember, reflect, renew, not what I want to do, but who I want to be. Happy New Year, everybody!
Happy New Year! Welcome to Simply Enough. This is Zachary and Elizabeth, and thanks for tuning in.
If you're liking our podcast, we'd love it if you'd share with your friends and family.
And then rate and review to raise our visibility and spread the message of enoughness.
We love you, and remember, you are simply enough.
Just as you are.
Period.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Simply Enough. I'm Mr. Zachary Linnert.
And I'm Dr. Elizabeth Ignacio.
Dr. Ignacio, the new year's coming.
Yes, it is. End of 2022, bringing in 2023.
That's right.
Woot woot. So here comes the new year. And I don't know, are you a new year person, Zachary? I'm not. When we were, if I can just kick it off, when we were residents in training, we always had to, amongst each other, kind of barter for who's going to cover which holidays and who's going to be on call and who's going to be in the hospital during the holidays. Mm-hmm. And like, for the most part, I was always very quick to immediately volunteer if nobody, minded, and depended where I was on the hierarchy totem pole. But I would always volunteer that I would cover New Year's easily and happily, because Christmas is definitely what is most precious to me. And then, as we talked about in the previous episode, Thanksgiving had become quite precious to me. And New Year's, honestly, I couldn't give a rat's patootie to the point where our younger listeners, this won't resonate. Sorry, everybody. But one of the biggest New Year's was the change of the millennium, right? Mm-hmm. So what did we call it? Y2K.
Y2K.
Right. So when we went from 1999 to 2000. And so that was a big deal for the new year. And there's even a big worry about, is the entire world going to collapse based on, computers and, digital systems and whatnot. So Y2K was the kind of a big New Year to be bigger than all New Year's. Right. And I was quick to say, I'll be on call. I'll be in the hospital for New Year because New Year's is just kind of not a big holiday for me. I love the idea of something new. So I always love the idea of, day one. Mm-hmm. But that could be, day one of the month or day one of the season or page one or starting something new. I do love new, but the holiday itself, with the countdown to, midnight and all of the drinking and the boozing and the fireworks, I'm happy to either I was in the hospital during residency, and now as a parent, I'm happy to be in bed by 10 o'clock and have a good night's sleep. So that's what New Year's is for me. I'm wondering for you, Zachary, what do you think?
Well, we are in similar company here.
By the way, holy Debbie Downer. Sorry, everybody.
Yeah, listeners, don't tar and feather us, but it's both of us here.
It's both of us. Okay.
Both of us. Similar. I mean, I never had necessarily to work, but I didn't like also the pressure of needing someone to kiss on New Year's. And so, early on in my 20s, when I was living in New York City, the idea of you've got to go out and be out at the pressure, I guess, to be at a club or be somewhere fun and pay all this money and look a certain way and then have someone to kiss and all this stuff. And I just didn't care. I didn't buy into it. I didn't buy into the beliefs about it. I will say that one year I wanted to go to Times Square and be in that mob of people. I know when we think about it now after a pandemic, like the idea of being stuck in the middle of that kind of crowd, I think, I start sweating and everything. But anyway, that was just
funny. I have the opposite. I'm like, oh, that sounds fun.
Right?
Because of the pandemic, I'm like, oh, how wonderful to be amongst everybody. How funny.
Well, but it was more just the experience. It wasn't because I love New Year's. I love the holiday. I'm like you. Christmas, Thanksgiving, those are holidays I get really excited about. New Year's, I'm happy to be at home with a nice bottle of champagne and comfy clothes, and that's about it. Similar to you too, I love the idea of something new. So I get behind the idea of kind of marking an occasion of something new or day one of something. But as we've talked in this podcast before, that kind of mindset can happen on July 28th or March 10th, so I don't really buy into we need to celebrate big with the prefix dinner or the club and the big party and the fancy clothes and the something to do and the someone to kiss. That's just not my thing.
Okay. So we feel the same way there.
Yeah.
Curious, how do you feel about resolutions?
I struggle with this because I'm a very goal-oriented, goal-setting kind of person. Okay. So, and as somebody who's constantly trying to look inward and reflect on things that I'm interested in that I might want to pursue or areas of my life that I want to grow and maybe evolve. And I love the idea behind a resolution. Okay. With my students, when the kind of the new year would come up, we would talk about resolutions and pull back from the idea that you have to start something January 1st and keep it going, and more like, what is the point of this? I have to say, I don't really subscribe to the idea of like January 1st, I have to have a resolution that I'm going to like put this pressure on myself and I'm going to hold to it. And if I don't get it by whatever date, then I've somehow failed in the success of my resolution. So it's a little bit of a mixed message, which is like, I love the idea of setting a goal and I love the idea of kind of the launch of something. And I like the idea of culminating the end of some work too. But the idea of a New Year's resolution, oh, not so much.
How funny. You? I am the same. I am not myself. Yes. I'm
twinsies.
Yeah, twinsies. I love you, Zachary. I am not a resolution person. And in a way, this might surprise some people, the surgeon that I am and everything. I'm not even necessarily a goal person either. Obviously, to get things done along the way, there are steps. And so those steps can be kind of microscopic goals for a macroscopic thing. But for the most part, I am more objective driven as opposed to goal driven, meaning I would like to aim for a certain direction as opposed to a particular spot. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
For example, I knew that I wanted to be, quote, a doctor, but what kind of doctor, like that changed along the way. So there was the objective of becoming a doctor, but the goal of being an orthopedic surgeon in sports medicine, I had no idea until I got to that point, having taken steps prior. Do you see what I'm saying? So I almost feel that goals are almost maybe let's say resolutions then instead of goals can be self-limiting, and as opposed to something more overarching and far-reaching like an objective that is limitless in some ways. And I can't help in sports. I think about, definitely for me in golf, for example. Yeah, I cannot golf. So thank God for large, wide fairways, because I'm certainly not aiming for a particular spot. I'm not even, aiming for a particular spot on the green, for example. I hope my ball goes in that direction and then I'll work it out from there, kind of thing. So I am more a objective kind of person as opposed to a direct goal type of person. I think because of the perfectionist in me, if I don't reach that goal, to kind of a point that you were trying to make was, if I don't reach that goal, then I'm all about the self-shame, the self-definition, and the self-failure and all that kind of stuff. Whereas I feel like objectives allow for more room of self-compassion, which from that point, one could propel further towards the objective. Whereas sometimes if I fail to meet a goal, I know my personality, which I'm working on, but my personality is, then I'll just give up and be like, well, what the hell? Then I'm going to eat the whole cake, since I couldn't stop myself from taking a forkful. Now that I've taken this forkful, I'm going to take the whole freaking cake, so that kind of self-defeating mechanism, I've learned to, rather than go for specific goals, go for objectives, and even relative to resolutions, rather than goals, objectives of traits, meaning, who do I want to be? Not what do I want to accomplish, but who do I want to be? Do I want to be a more forgiving person? Then apply that characteristic, or where can I apply that trait in my life? Do I want to be more generous? Do I want to be more reliable? Do I want to do what I say I'm going to do? That kind of thing. That way, that's a trait and an objective, as opposed to a fixed finite goal.
I was just going to ask for myself and also our listeners and viewers who are hearing this, and it's making a lot of sense to me, how to delineate between a goal and an objective to really help myself, I'll speak out loud, understand which of the two place I'm kind of in. And let me share an example of what I mean, because what I immediately thought of once you switched right at the end of talking about a characteristic or who you want to be, I remember about 3 years ago, it happened to be in January, but that wasn't because of the new year. I recognized as somebody who has some latent body image issues, that I wanted to establish a goal of feeling healthy and being a healthy person. Now, I would be lying if I say there weren't some vanity things there. Like, I did want, a nicer chest or nicer arms or something like that. But really my objective there, to use your word, it was more of a characteristic that I wanted to embody. Rather, I wanted to bench this amount of weight, or I wanted to have these many abs, or those kinds of goals. So immediately, as I was like ready to ask you to help me delineate between a goal and objective, I think an objective kind of came out just organically in what you were sharing about identifying a type of characteristic that I wanted to see myself grow into, or evolve into, or at least expand upon. I think I was somewhat of a healthy person to begin with, and I wanted to let it kind of blossom a little bit more. So the idea of a goal versus an objective, and how we as listeners can think reflectively on which one we're in, just to acknowledge, how have you distilled that over time to realize which is which, and which to pursue or which to back off of?
I just feel like an objective is a bigger overarching, like I said, direction that will require steps in that direction. And so we can call those steps goals. But with that overarching objective, or that overarching direction, should I take a misstep, that doesn't mean I failed turnaround, or I failed stop in the tracks, or, I failed choose a different direction. It's more lesson learned. This step took me off the path a little bit, but lesson learned, back on the path. So I don't put as much weight on the goal itself if I can keep that overarching objective or direction in mind.
Okay, well, let me share a story then, if you don't mind, that kind of connects with this. I wish I had these words back when I was teaching these students, because I was kind of getting close to what you were saying, although not nearly as articulately. When I was teaching, my very first year teaching, I was at a school for the deaf in Brooklyn, New York. I was teaching 7th and 8th grade. And at that point, the students had come to understand that every year, one of their writing assignments that they had to do was to write their resolutions and then say how they're going to meet them and whatnot. So I didn't know this because I was a new teacher, and also clearly I didn't subscribe to it then, and I don't now. So they asked Mr. Leonard, like, are we gonna be doing our resolutions? And I said, what are you talking about? And they share just like the history of, now they're eighth graders and they've been doing this every year. And I'm not speaking ill about the previous teachers that they had. It just, this is what they had come into my classroom with. So we had a really fantastic conversation about the idea of resolutions and whatnot. I also, without any specific statistics or anything, talked about just the failure rate of resolutions also, and how often and we'll speak about health, right? And like particular people want to get, quote, in shape, or they want to go to the gym, and then gym memberships will really kind of prey on that. And then they know that membership or attendance will decline in February because most people, they just don't keep up their attendance. So anyway, so I cited that and was talking to them about the idea of what really is going on in this moment in the resolutions. And for these 7th and 8th graders, deaf students who I think don't get these kinds of conversations, many of them don't get these kinds of conversations home because many of their parents are hearing and aren't as fluent in ASL as they are. They didn't have the level of conversation that we were having about the idea of what they, quote unquote, impose upon themselves. And the sign for pressure was the sign that I kept using. And if you want to switch to YouTube now to check this out, the sign for pressure is literally the hand pushing down. And that was the sign that when you talk about an imposition, even a resolution, a promise, pushes pressure down on the person. So even in ASL, you see this implied meaning of this idea that something is, quote unquote, imposed on you or putting pressure on you. So we could really use language as a vehicle or as an entry into this idea that you're talking about, which is an objective, which is very different. If we think about an objective as being something that's beyond you, that you look towards, and it ends up being kind of a beacon, that was where we really established in ASL the difference between a resolution versus something that you are striving for, that is forward thinking and forward moving and forward looking. I love the idea, and I wish I'd had it then, but even the idea of an objective as being, like, you use golf as a really good example. A hole is a very small, very specific target. And if you don't make it into that hole, you've got to keep going. But the idea of something kind of broad and big upon which you can land, I love that. And
that's the direction versus the spot.
Yeah. So anyway, my conversation with my 7th and 8th graders certainly connects with what you were saying. I think for me, I'm going to reframe my own thinking about myself as a goal setter, because as I reflect out loud, I really am more objective driven.
Yes. Objective driven. So being objective driven is more about opportunity and possibility. And that's what I mean by it being limitless, as opposed to a goal is very finite and very concrete. And therefore it's very zero-sum game. It's very, didn't do it. Won at it, lost at it, succeeded, failed. I mean, I'm not sugarcoating life. I mean, that is the reality of the steps you take in the direction. All I'm saying, though, is if you keep your eye on the prize, if you keep your eye on an overarching objective, then even, like I said, the missteps, the goals that didn't work out, win some, learn some. and it doesn't halt you right there in your tracks to the point where you're going to abandon that journey and you're going to abandon that direction. It's more, I hate using this word now because we use it so much because of the pandemic, but that's where one pivots, one learns and one pivots, and it still moves towards the direction. There is a NFL, I think he was a linebacker, but now he's a commentator, Emmanuel Aiko. Am I mispronouncing it? But anyway, I loved what he said. He said once along the lines, forgive me, I'm paraphrasing, but an accomplished goal is the penalty paid for setting the goal in the first place. So isn't that interesting that he's actually putting it almost a negative, that like, okay, fine, you set the goal and you accomplish it. That's actually a penalty because you don't know what more you could have accomplished. And it harkens a little bit to, we mentioned in a previous episode, Michelangelo talks about what is worse, aiming high and missing the mark, or aiming low and making it. You don't know what you missed and what you limited yourself to by setting the bar low just so you can make the goal. Now, if it's that you have an overarching objective or an overarching direction, and again, you have to plan steps towards that, and we can call those steps goals, and you make that goal and you accomplish that goal, great. But that's still to serve in the direction of the overarching objective. Again, the micro steps for the macro objective, the macro direction.
I'm laughing a little because this makes a lot of sense for me, specifically as a school leader. I was constantly, I would guess, floating up to that 40,000 view and seeing where we were going and trying to keep us there so that we didn't get stuck in the quote unquote setbacks or the little hiccups that happen along the way. Because if we had set our goals down there, we wouldn't have really kind of kept ourselves moving in the direction that we wanted to as a division and whatnot. And yet that kind of thinking that you're talking about, I didn't really apply to my own life. I think it's changed or evolved as I've gotten a little bit older, but even still, I can recognize when I first started my fitness journey, so to speak, and being a lot more committed to a healthier lifestyle, I think it was really more embedded with more of these goals. Like I wanted this personal record on the bench, or I wanted, this kind of body look, rather than, and it changed where I just wanted to be healthy and I wanted to be strong. And that means that sometimes I can have the slice of cake. That's not necessarily a misstep, because that's all couched in the idea of a balanced, healthy lifestyle. Whereas if I was so committed to getting a certain body fat or weight or whatever, those goals precluded me from seeing those moments of having a slice of cake or piece of pizza or whatever as actually being part of the whole process.
It's part of the whole journey. Celebrate the steps by all means. So any micro goals towards the macro objective that you reach, awesome, celebrate it, but you're not done there, because you're headed in the direction of an objective. And when you don't make that step, it doesn't mean it was all for nothing. Rethink the objective and rethink the direction. Does that make sense?
It totally does. I just had a conversation with a friend of mine who describes himself as a writer, but he's written, I think he mentioned like 17 books. And I said, I was kind of floored because I didn't know that about him, that he had written that many books. And I said, wow, that's incredible. And he said, but I haven't published any of them. He said, what's an interesting statistic about writers is most of the stuff that they will write will never see, other eyes will never see that. And I said, I believe it. And I share all this to say that I very much understand what you're saying, because at least for my friend, if we looked at publishing a book, the goal, let's say the goal of publishing a book rather than the objective of being a writer, if we looked at the goal of publishing a book as being the goal, well, he would have quit a long time ago, because look at the books that he's quote unquote written that have never been published.
So those books that he wrote were the steps
exactly
towards his being a writer, not defined by the goal of publishing.
Yeah, that thank you. And we actually had at Iolani, we had an author come, and he had a binder or like a little notebook with him, and it was just chock full of story ideas that he had started and then abandoned, or started and then just said, this isn't the right time. And so that book was a physical representation of his objective of being a writer.
So take, for example, your and mine and many objective to be healthier. So, for example, one thing that I do in terms of nighttime eating. Okay. So nighttime eating, not the healthiest thing, everybody. And then for me, especially, my nighttime eating is like, sugar. And in my journey towards the objective of being healthier, that's one thing that I look at. And for many nights, I am much more successful now in terms of not doing nighttime snacking and digging my hand in the bowl of M&Ms or whatnot, or like opening the freezer and seeing what kind of ice cream we have. So I am, for the most part, quote, successful in not doing so. For the evenings when I find myself thinking about it, debating about it, and yet still falling off the wagon, if you will, what I tell myself is, okay, for today, I didn't succeed. I took a misstep, but there's always tomorrow. Number one. And number two, I celebrate, or maybe not celebrate, but I at least acknowledge, and I give myself props for recognizing, okay, well, at least I didn't blindly do this. And that is a step for me. Whereas normally I wouldn't think about it. I would almost even repress the guilt, and I would just dive into that half gallon of ice cream. Or I would say, well, if I had this, this Twix bar, I can have the second Twix bar, in the candy bar. And I would just kind of numbly do that. Whereas I, at least even with the misstep, I give myself a little self-compassion and say, okay, I recognize, though, at least I'm aware of it, and that's a step. I acknowledge it, and that will empower me tomorrow to get back on the wagon and not have nighttime snacking. Does that help? I mean, it's small, but see how even in turning what seemingly is a quote failed goal, dun dun dun, or a misstep, dun dun dun, there is still actually even positive that I can hang on to. That without self-shame, I can say, well, I know better, and in knowing better, I recognize that I still dug my hand in the M&M bowl, but tomorrow I won't do that, because I'm going to dig deeper in the fact that I knew and I was aware of what I did, and I'm not going to do that tomorrow. Does that help? Or actually, now that I heard those words come out of my mouth, I'm like, no, that sucks. Actually, what I just said.
It makes sense to me, because we'll talk about on the days when you stay on the wagon. Do you celebrate those days as well? So
Absolutely.
that there is some balance. Okay.
Yes.
Which is why I think
it changes my identity in my mind. What I'm telling myself, the itty bitty shitty community in my mind, is, well, I fell off the wagon and I dug my hand in the M&M jar today, but the past 5 days I didn't. So you know what? I'm gonna be that person tomorrow.
What you're saying makes me think about a unit that we had in my first grade classroom on poetry, and poetry for teachers can be a difficult unit to teach because there are so many non-rules about poetry, right? We know with like nonfiction writing, there are things that we can teach children, very prescriptive recipe ways of writing. Even with fiction, there are kinds of formulas that we can give them and say, by the end of this, you've written a fairy tale, so to speak. But poetry is tricky, right? Because it's such a beautifully ambiguous genre. Now, children love poetry because they get to throw all the rules out in many ways, and they get to do it in a way in which they want to. So what you're talking about makes me think about poetry in that one of the units of study was really not about completing a poem as it was building a poet's mindset. And the objective was really moving towards finding that poet identity within a child and encouraging them to work in a way that progressed them to believe or see themselves as potentially a poet should they want. So even though the unit had these little quote unquote goals along the way where they would have to produce some kinds of work, the celebration at the end of that unit was not so much that they completed all these pieces. And in fact, they would open their writer's folder and see a whole like packet full of poems that they had written. What they did is they actually saw a packet that demonstrated that they had moved further on the path towards seeing themselves as a poet. And so what you're talking about makes me think about that. Like there were the quote unquote wins and losses in there, the poems that they didn't decide that they wanted to publish and the poems that they did. But really the objective was to have to engender a space where they could see themselves as a poet, should that be something that interests them. So what you're saying kind of, does that connection make sense to what totally. We're talking about?
I just can't help but smile because, and listeners and viewers, by all means, totally disagree with me. I'm just talking about my own process in terms of what pulls me, what matters to me is not so much a checklist of things to do. And maybe it's just where I am in my life or I have been in my life in terms of midlife and that kind of stuff. Rather than goals to reach, what is transformative? How can I transform myself? And that is a overarching objective of identity, if you will, as opposed to things to do. And what I mean by that is as we're talking about New Year's resolutions and objective versus goal, I can't help but giggle because it makes me think of things like Lent. And during Lent, for those of the not of the Christian faith, Lent is the 40 days that precede Easter. And for many faiths, definitely in the Catholic faith, but for other faiths as well, that is often a time that is used for mindful cleansing, if you will, of one's life in terms of making really resolutions in one's life. So it's like New Year's resolutions, but now in Lent, a lot of people practice it by giving up something. I'm going to give up chocolate. Ironically, it's usually often veiled as health things too. Yeah. I'm going to give up chocolate. I'm going to give up sugar. I'm going to give up, this kind of thing. And I just know myself, and again, this might not resonate with our listeners and viewers, so thank you everybody for your patience, but the giving up of things, when one does that, one is supposed to do that in order to be more mindful of the sacrifices of what Jesus gave up and will be giving up upon Easter weekend. And it just never resonated with me because I'll admit it, I pretty much failed every time in terms of the giving up chocolate or the, I think I said this in one of the previous episodes. I swore, how ironic I use that word. I swore to give up cursing, to give up profanity, and that every time that I would use a profanity, I would put, a quarter in my profanity jar so that it would be then used as an offering at the end of Lent. And I think within the first day, I put in $20 in advance because I just knew that I couldn't do it. So this goal setting during Lent was not at least resonating with me. It certainly wasn't reaching the overarching point, which is to feel closer in my faith and feel closer to Jesus and to God. And so what I use Lent now for is something more transformative, as opposed a transformative objective of who I am and how I show up and who do I want to be, as opposed to a to-do list. So for me, Lent, if you call it resolutions for Lent, similar to resolutions for New Year's, is who do I want to be? How can I show up more as a Christian? So how can I be more merciful in my day? How can I be more forgiving in my day? How can I be more loving towards each other, towards others? That's where Lent and the purpose that Lent is supposed to serve in terms of my being more mindful, my being more present with myself and others, and with, my God, is how I approach the quote resolutions of Lent. And just like that, I also approach my resolutions for the new year more in that way. I want to be healthier. I want to be more patient. I want to, I don't know, be a better listener, that kind of thing.
I appreciate that we approach this podcast really trying to come back to ourselves, right? Simply enough, me. And you're reminding us of that if you're a listener or a viewer that subscribes to setting or enjoying New Year's, which we are not those people, but if you are, good for you, right? And you do take that opportunity, I think the reframing of what a resolution can look like and bringing it back to simply enough, I think can be really helpful for me. And I actually now am looking at New Year's differently. Whereas I think I looked at it like, kind of bah humbug about this time of year when I just didn't really understand the celebration. I didn't really buy into it. But even just the idea of taking a moment to look inward, which I do naturally anyway, but to actually have kind of like another time of the year to just stop and pause and look inward and look at myself and say, yes, I'm simply enough, but who do I want to continue to grow into? And are there characteristics that I want to move towards? I just thank you for that reframing, because now I've even reframed my own feeling about New Year's in general.
Right. Well, so a resolution, what is a resolution? A resolution is when you resolve to do something. And I can't help but think of that prefix RE. You're resolving, you're resolving, you're solving what more you want to be, who you want to grow into. And with that resolve, what is a new year great for? It's for rejuvenation, renewal, re-energizing, much bigger, larger magnet that's pulling you than the small little pushes to reach a goal. So with this upcoming new year, I'm going to resolve, remember, reflect, renew, reiterate, not what I want to do, but who I want to be. I want to be more grateful. I want to be more patient. I want to be more loving. I want to be more compassionate. I want to be more giving. And I want to be, did I say I want to be more grateful?
Yeah, you did. You love that word.
I do. I love that word. I want to be more joyful. If we aim for that, then how can we fail? How can we miss the mark in our goals?
Yeah, we can't. And I think I'm going to take your resolutions and add on to them and say, I want to be more kind to myself. I want to be more compassionate towards myself. I want to commit to renewals for myself and how I'm loving and compassionate and grateful for me, because I think I often put objectives outward as they impact others. I want to be kind to others. I want to be grateful to others, which I do. But I'm now looking at the renewal of going inward and taking what you're saying and keeping that objective for myself. As it will build me, it will trickle out and then have effects on others. So I am actually,
or not trickle out, it might overflow to others.
Yes.
Yes. Fill that cup, love.
So look at what happened. Okay. Talk about a convert. Started this episode saying, no, not really a big New Year's person. And here I am, very proud about a New Year's resolution or a resolution, period. It doesn't necessarily have to be New Year's.
Yeah, because the resolution's towards objective, not towards finite goals.
That's
we
right.
are limitless, everybody. We are divine and we are limitless. So let's enjoy, let's welcome, let's be excited for the new year. Happy New Year, everybody.
And let's remember that we are simply enough.
Just as we are, period.
Happy
New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year.
Bye-bye, 2022. Hello, 2023.